Hello and welcome. My name is Alan. Grab you a drink, pull you a seat up. Today we're going to do more on the executive branch. I hadn't forgot these series. Like I said, I'm just trying to get back into this. So today we are talking about president and vice president, which in the first executive office is going to be George Washington John Adams. Now, let's go over what the actual jobs and responsibilities of the president and vice president pertain to. President, he is the head of the executive branch, number one in the executive branch. He is considered the commander in chief of the U.S. military as a whole. He cannot declare a war, but he can do responses, that he feels are immediately necessary, since the act of sometimes getting Congress together can take a while, given that they're spread all over the continental U.S. Um, and so, yeah, you'll see sometimes presidents do bombings. Uh, you'll remember Trump bombing Syria, or I think it was Syria, and then um, Clinton doing a bombing in, I can't remember if it was Iraq or Kuwait, but they'll do these bombings as they have the right for immediate response action. They just can't declare a war, so they can do an action with the military and say, as a instant response. But Congress has the only power to declare war. The president also has the ability to write up treaties, being that he is the head of state, and meets with the other heads of state with both ally and enemy nations. So he writes treaties. Congress still has to pass them. So this is what we're looking at as the separation of powers. The executive, the judicial, and the legislative all have checks and balances upon one another, so that no one branch is supposed to be too powerful. Though some people would claim the judicial right now is overstepping its bounds. Anyway, the president also has the power to pardon sentences for those found guilty, those in jail. He has the right to commute their sentences, basically shrink them down to just time served. Um, they can do that. It's often used toward the end of their presidency or a term to try to gain a little extra bonus points, or to help others who they think could help them. So the president can do that. He also has the power to appoint individuals to certain roles. He can appoint federal and Supreme Court judges, though Congress has to approve them. So that's why you often see the hearings for these judges. Same with the members of his cabinet. He appoints the members of his cabinet, but the Congress usually has to go through and say, all right, well, we'll go with that. That's fine. blah, blah, blah. Usually there's not as much pushback as you would see on Supreme Court judges simply because the Supreme Court judges are for life and control the judicial branch. Um, but yeah, that is a great majority of what the president can do. Now, there are some other less written out abilities. Executive orders, they are legislative acts that do not have the full power that laws passed by Congress would have. They have some strength, but not near as powerful as a full law passed by Congress. Secondly, there's also executive privilege. This is the idea to refuse certain things, being that you are president. This was set as a precedent by George Washington, the first president, when he refused to give up treaty notes that John Jay had written while negotiating a treaty he had made. I think it was with Great Britain. So yeah, um, it's just kind of been a precedent ever since. Um, it is not expressly written down in the Constitution, which most of your powers of the president are in Article 2 of the Constitution that lists out requirements and responsibilities of the president. Uh, but that is your president's responsibilities and abilities. Looking at the vice president now, the vice president's role almost feels kind of like an afterthought. It's like he has some abilities, but it's more just if the president needs to be away from office because of whatever reason, illness, injury, uh, assassination attempt, whatever, the vice president is the next in line to step in as president during that president's term. Um, the vice president is a uh, main member for the National Defense Council, so he does a lot with national defense. He is also a member, kind of two different branches. We often talk about these checks and balances, but not only is he in the executive branch as second in line, he also is the president of the Senate, meaning that if a law passes the U.S. House of Representatives and goes to the Senate, and there is a 50-50 tie, the vice president can then cast a tie-breaking vote. Any other time he don't vote in the Senate, it's just in those cases to break ties. So, because of course the Senate is always going to be an even numbered uh, governing body because it's 2 senators per state. It's not meant to be a representation of population, whereas the House of Representatives is. The Senate is meant to give states an equal standing with each other so that bigger states can't just push around smaller states. You know, so that states as big as California can't push around these tiny states population-wise, like Wyoming. So, yeah, he is president of the Senate. He is also, in the case of impeachment trials, the president, the head of those impeachment trials. He helps lead the trials themselves. So if the president is impeached, if members of the cabinet are impeached, he heads those trials, unless, of course, he is one of those being impeached, in which case you would, kind of hope he would recuse himself. He wouldn't be allowed to head his own impeachment trial. But yeah, he also is the uh, required to be the head in the electoral count. Um, his job is to confirm and verify this candidate gets so many votes for president and this candidate gets so many votes. Such and such is the winner based on the votes from the Electoral College, which I believe honestly should be abolished. But that's another story altogether. I'm going into tangents off on the side, but sometimes I can't help it because some of this stuff is ridiculous. Now, the Senate can also be a representative of state, serving to meet with other heads of state, um, where he is in the executive branch. That being said, like I said, it's kind of confusing because he's both legislative and executive branch. And to make it even more confusing, his office was on Capitol Hill, where the other members of Congress's offices were, up until 1961, when he gained his own office in the White House with the president, and literally became closer to the executive branch. Um, so yeah, it's just kind of interesting. Um, but yeah, that's what the vice president is capable of doing. But now let's talk about the original president and vice president. Our first president ever elected was George Washington. He, although his views aligned more with the Federalists, he did not want to proclaim himself as being of any party. One of the things he warned about when he became president is the party system. He's like, it can be detrimental to our government. But he was born on the Rappahannock River, on a farm. I think it was the Ferry Farm, on the Rappahannock River, which was across from Fredericksburg, to Augustine Washington and Mary Ball. Augustine Washington had 4 children with his first wife. Then he marries Mary Ball and has 6 more children, of which Washington was one. Washington would go to school kind of irregularly. He would learn things like mathematics, geography, some Latin. He would also learn on the farm growing tobacco and taking care of livestock. So, it's kind of a mixed combination of what he did. His father would pass away when Washington was 11 years of age. And so he's working on Augustine's estate in Virginia, which Augustine had earned because his father, John Washington, had migrated from England to Virginia. So Washington was a third generation American, which still technically he was British as a colonist, but he was the second generation of Washingtons born into America, what would be America. Anyway, uh, yeah, his father died when he was 11. A lot of his story is kind of mixed in with, of course, the whole chopping down cherry trees, I cannot tell a lie, which of course is kind of filler. It's not real evidence of who Washington was. Um, he would go live with his brother, well, his half brother, a son of Augustine's to his first wife, Lawrence Washington. Because Lawrence Washington will purchased a property called Mount Vernon. He named it Mount Vernon, um, and Washington would live there with Lawrence, and eventually he would inherit the property from Lawrence when Lawrence took ill with tuberculosis. Um, so George himself would inherit the property at a very young age. I think he was in his late teens, early 20s. Um, so yeah. Now, he would serve early in his life as a surveyor, working almost constantly for as surveyor of Culpeper County in Virginia, while he still continued his education. He would also serve under, I think it was Lord Fairfax, um, especially when there were conflicts between the French and English in the Americas. Washington was sent as an envoy uh, by Lord Fairfax, and they almost accomplished peace, but war would intervene. Well, more fighting would intervene. Things would get more tense. Washington would go back and would be sent with another party to try to accomplish things. It wouldn't go well, and soon we would have the outbreak of what was known as the French and Indian War, or AKA the 7 Years' War. If you're in the US, it's French and Indian. If you're learning from Europe, it's 7 years. Now, uh, Washington had served as envoy, but when he finally arrived, was allowed to arrive back, he would join Lord Fairfax, specifically at Fairfax's, or was it not? No, it wasn't Fairfax. It was General Braddock, I believe. I apologize. It was General Braddock. He would arrive at Braddock's request, where he had already been sent as an envoy twice to the French. So he was well aware of the territory and everything. And he was even granted the military rank of a colonel. But he was to be Braddock's personal advisor um, in this war. He didn't always make the best of decisions, but he was willing to speak up and even disagree greatly with Braddock, which Braddock didn't take much offense to, as he held some respect for Washington. So, yeah, he would gain a lot of experience. But towards the end of the war, he would leave because he would be elected to the Virginia House of Burgesses. Basically, a House of Representatives, but that's what it was called before, the House of Burgesses. He would be elected and thus was allowed to leave the military with an honorary rank of lieutenant general. Um, but yeah, after he left as a lieutenant general, he served in the House of Burgesses, but the French and Indian War had ended, but there was a storm brewing. Revolution was on its way. Eventually, Washington would take part in the Continental Congresses and even be named uh, commander in chief of the military forces, since he had so much military experience and would be the one to serve as the prime general during the Revolutionary War. And of course, the Revolutionary War is a little more well known. You have all these battles. You have the Cold Winter at Valley Forge, Washington crossing the Delaware. He would make a lot of brave stands, and some moves were quite brilliant. But he would need help, and he would get it from others from Europe who wanted to see England be bent a bit. So you would have people like former Prussian military officer von Steuben help Washington in training the troops and everything. But yeah, the U.S. would eventually win the Revolutionary War. I think it was only like 4 or 5, 6 years in length, about that long. Um, America would win a very up and down, but they would eventually win the war. And it was pretty much a very solid decision um, that after the war, America still ran under the Articles of Confederation. But the need for change was seen. So, the Constitution was drawn up, and pretty heavily Washington was favored to be president. And John Adams was elected to be his vice president. Washington would serve 2 terms, and he would then leave, head back to his property in Mount Vernon to his wife, Martha Washington. Martha was formerly Martha Custis, a widow that he had married years and years before. But Washington would die 2 years after leaving the presidency. He would have other views. He was one of these founding fathers who's like, don't necessarily agree with slavery. I don't think it should be a thing, but I mean, it is, so I'm going to use it. I have slaves. But he didn't want to break families up, so he would often refuse to sell slaves. And so, at times, the property at Mount Vernon would be so full of slaves that it was just an overabundant number to run the property, but he didn't want to break the families up. And upon his death, the slaves would be bequeathed to Martha Washington, who Washington asked that after she dies to go ahead and release them, and that's what happens. So again, it's kind of a mixed bag with his view on slavery and everything, but that's a look at who George Washington was. Now, next person we want to look at, Sam Adams. Not Sam Adams, John Adams. Sam Adams is his older cousin. He was a real person, although now he's just known, hey, that's a beer. But John Adams was born a Puritan in Braintree, Massachusetts. His religion was Puritanism, but he was very educated. He would go to Harvard University, even graduate, become a lawyer. He would teach for a short time before becoming a lawyer, but yeah, he was a very brilliant man. But as I said, he would become a lawyer, and he would get involved in politics. So yeah, I mean, he would get involved a lot with that. He would marry a young woman. I believe her name was Abigail Smith. Of course, she would become Abigail Adams. Let me take a look at this and verify. I want to make sure. I think it was Abigail Smith. Give me a moment here. But he was born October the 30th, 1735. Now, as I said, he married one Abigail Smith, Yeah, that was her name, correct name. Abigail Smith. She would become Abigail Adams. John Adams' religion was Puritanism, but oh, the letters, the correspondence back and forth between John, and Abigail, they're known to be a bit steamy sometimes. If you've never read them, it's something to check out. Um, but yeah, he would go into politics and become quite constant in them. He was often one to write um, many papers and even wrote in opposition to the British Stamp Act under the pen name Humphrey Plowjogger. So yeah, he would be in the heart of the political turmoil because Massachusetts was very much at the center of what was going to be the revolution, because that was the biggest part of where the intolerable, intolerable acts of Britain were placed upon, was Massachusetts. But yeah, he would be also a member of the Continental Congress, representing the colony of Massachusetts, where Washington had represented Virginia. Um, he would, after the war, serve as ambassadors to places such as France and the Dutch Republic, Great Britain. After the Constitution was written, he was back in America and would be um, the runner up to Washington, thus becoming the vice president, and served both terms of Washington's presidency as vice president. Now, after Washington left office, he would actually run for office again and become president. He would only serve one term, as when he ran for re-election, he came in third place. His actual term in office, it it wasn't the best. It struggled with such things as the XYZ affair, the Alien and Sedition Acts, and the Quasi War. But yeah. Anyway, after he left the presidency, um, he went back and mainly just worked at his farm. Um, he abhorred slavery and thus would hold no slaves. Let me see if I can find that quote here. Um, I'm having trouble finding it. Bear with me a moment. slavery. He said, I have, through my whole life, held the practice of slavery in such abhorrence that I have never owned a Negro or any other slave, though I have lived for many years in times when the practice was not disgraceful, when the best men in my vicinity thought it not inconsistent with their character, and when it has cost me thousands of dollars for the labor and subsistence of free men, which I might have saved by the purchase of Negroes at times when they were very cheap. So, yeah, he disagreed with the use of slavery, even though it could have been a benefit and it was seen as normal by others. Yeah, he worked on the farm. He kind of developed a friendship and rivalry with Thomas Jefferson because they would serve under George Washington, and then of course Jefferson would be elected to after Adams. So, um, but they would have a bit of a rivalry. Um, and they would have correspondence with each other, writing each other's letters. But it's famous that Adams would regret saying he believed, alas, I perish, but Jefferson is still alive. The actual quote, let's see. Let me see if I can find that actual quote. Okay, on July the 4th, 1826, 50 years after the adoption of the Declaration of Independence, John Adams would die at approximately 6:20 p.m. His last words included an acknowledgement of Thomas Jefferson, his friend and rival. He would say, Thomas Jefferson survives. As he right before he died. But he was unaware of the fact that Jefferson had actually died several hours before Adams. So it's one of those kind of friendship rivalries between the two. But yeah, Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, but John would be buried in a crypt with his wife Abigail, and his son John Quincy Adams, who was a president as well, would also be buried in that crypt with his wife. So, yeah, um, those were the responsibilities and abilities of the president and vice president, and then look at who Washington and Adams were. But yeah, this has been a long one, but I'm going to end this episode here. As always, educate thyself. Think, read, study, learn. Someone tries to tell you something you have trouble believing, ask them to cite their sources. I'll be listing these sources in the description below the video. I'll see you all in the next episode. Until then, later.